webinar on helping people to transition to universal credit. It is our most in-demand webinar we have had. So we have, we might go over the subscription limit. I'm a little concerned about that, but we've had a huge amount of demand for the webinar here. Before we get started, I just want to do a brief audio check. So for those of you attendees that are logged on, please can you, you should on the right-hand panel be able to raise your hand. So if a few of you can do that, that's good. It looks like the audio is working fine. And before we get started, I just wanted to say that you've got the opportunity to ask questions in the panel on the right-hand side. So just use the chat box there to ask questions as we go through. I'll be chairing a question and answer session at the end. There'll be a few polls and a survey as we go through the presentation, and we'll aim to finish by 11:30. But in this case, given the level of demand, if there are a lot of questions and it feels like there's the opportunity, we might overrun by 5 minutes or so, just to make sure we cover off everything that's interesting, just given the number of attendees we've got today. As I mentioned, it's the most in-demand webinar we have had, and I would like to say that was all down to me, but actually I think it's down to the phenomenal speakers we have today. So we've got Ian Corey, who we've been working with at the Aster Group for a number of years now, who's going to be talking about how they have been preparing for the implementation of universal credit, more so from the perspective of the organization and how that's filtering down. We've also got Carl Larty and Natasha Jebison of Croydon Council on to give a frontline perspective. And from the policy and practice side, we've got Zoe Charlesworth, who is our head of policy and responsible for putting together a number of the tools we've developed to help people transition onto universal credit. Do each of you want to give a quick hello? Ian, do you want to say hi?
Hi, welcome everyone. This is my first webinar presentation, so not being able to see your faces is a bit of a struggle for me, but I'm very much looking forward to it.
Well, they're all smiling, Ian, don't worry. Natasha, Carl? Carl, Natasha?
Yeah, we're here. Hello.
Great.
Hello, Carl Larty, Croydon Council.
Great. And Zoe?
Oh, hello. Hello, everybody.
And yes, it is a shame you can't see all of their wonderful faces, but I think their content and what's in their head is really what we're here to hear about today. I'll give a brief introduction now to why we host these webinars or what they're for. I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. It'll be followed by a short poll to understand what challenges you guys are facing when you're thinking about implementing universal credit, just so we know at the outset really what the audience are most interested in, and we'll tailor the talk accordingly. Ian's going to talk a little bit, as I said, about organizational preparedness and how your organization can prepare. Zoe's going to talk a little bit about strategies we put in place and we've helped organizations put in place to help their clients be prepared. And Natasha and Carl are going to talk about things from a local authority perspective, but equally from a frontline perspective. So for the advisors that are on the call, really what challenges they can expect as more and more people move on to universal credit. Let me just kick off with a poll and ask you, what are your biggest challenges for rolling out universal credit? To do that, I just need to click this, launch the poll, and you should all see a poll window pop up. The options are, what are your biggest challenges for rolling out UC? Just select one of the following: the administration of payments to landlords, clients moving across to the monthly payment cycle, the application process for universal credit and supporting residents through that, the communication with both to DWP and from DWP in terms of the information you're getting, and other. It's going to be really interesting to understand what comes back. And again, if for those sort of 7 to 10% that are clicking on other, if you want to sort of enter some information in the chat box, I'll try and see what else we're missing out on too. We've got 75%, 3/4 of you have voted. There's 5 seconds left. So let's wait and see. Great. Close poll. And we should be able to see the results. So you can see hopefully on your screen now that the biggest, clients moving across the monthly payment cycle is the biggest challenge. So that's something Zoe can talk about specifically in making sure people are aware of how their payments are going to fluctuate. The next three are all relatively even, or kind of. So the application process, supporting people through that for universal credit, the communication with DWP, the administration of payments to landlords, and then other. Sorry, Janet's just pointing out that I should have pressed share results. So you can see, hopefully now, those results, clients moving across the monthly payment cycle, the application process for universal credit, the communication with DWP, the administration of payments to landlords, and then other. And do enter in the chat box any further details you might want to sort of build on. So without further ado, I think that really helps us to frame the presentation. The reason Policy and Practice set these up is that we set out to make the welfare system simple to understand. We believe that if people can understand how these policies are going to affect them, they'll be in a better position to make decisions about work, about budgeting, and about really what's right for them. We do that in three ways. Primarily, we've built a software engine that models policies across 4 different government departments combined to show the impact of all of these policies and all of the reforms, not just universal credit, but things like changes in the tax allowance, changes in housing benefit if you're on the current system, to show how they affect the individual. We work with local organisations and their data to show how each of their residents are impacted, helping them to prioritise support. And we try and have an impact at the policy level. So that's why forums like these are great, because really it's the frontline perspective combined with our analytical expertise, putting the 2 stories together, that gives us a real ability to influence DWP, typically through conversations with ministers and civil servants, but occasionally through the press as well. And fundamentally, we believe that organisations that are prepared and doing the right things and thinking about things in the right way mean that clients can be better prepared as well, because really it's the local organisations that are getting that information out and across. And we need both of those things to be in place for a successful transition to universal credit, which is what this webinar is about. So without further ado, Ian, over to you, and just do mention whenever you'd like me to flick through the slides.
Excellent, thank you, Devin. Morning all. My name is Ian Corey, the Welfare Reform Manager at the Aster Group. We're a housing association made up of lots of LSVT transfers. We've got about 28,000 properties in our stock. We range from the south and southwest. We've had UC live service cases from February 15, and we've had UC full service cases from July 16. Currently, we've got 185 live service cases and 711 full service cases. So that's some of the stats out of the way. We're a member of the DWP Strategic Landlords Forum. We are a trusted partner, which allows us to determine our own APA decisions. And we are working with the DWP on various projects and pilots to help them test and learn in relation to UC development. In terms of the one KPI everyone is talking about, arrears, and by the way, KPI stands for Killing People's Initiative, not Key Performance Indicators. And so we just need to be aware, and I will say some controversial things today potentially, but I think that the focus on the KPI of arrears is the wrong thing to focus on, and we need to focus on individual customers a lot more and not worry too much about the arrears. That said, obviously it's a key performance indicator for our lenders and so forth, so we need to have a view of it. Our general needs customers are around about 2% in terms of arrears. Our UC customers are running around 7%. So clearly everyone knows universal credit does bring arrears. Can I have the next slide, please, Devin? Right, so helping people to claim benefits is the job of the benefit provider. I think in Aster we try to obviously help all our customers, but our first point of call is really to see what the DWP and our local authorities are doing. Now, the questions on the slide there, we should all ask ourselves these as we develop our approaches, making sure that we do add value and that we can help the DWP deliver their message. So let's be clear, the DWP and the local authorities have the resources, or at least the responsibilities, to transition people onto universal credit. Their money comes from general taxation. Our money as housing associations comes from our customers. So if we are to spend our customers' rent money on advice and support for other customers to help them transition onto universal credit, let's be absolutely sure that our spending is targeted where it is most needed, that it's efficiently spent, and that adds value for the customer. After all, while we have a role to play, it is not our responsibility to ensure the benefit system works. Now, that's a slightly controversial view in some ways, but I think it's a really important view. When we are thinking about the services that our customers need, the first thing that we think about is, what are the DWP doing? What are our local authorities doing? And how can we help them deliver services to our customers? And I think working in that partnership way, recognizing that they've got those resources to deliver those services, is always a good first step. Clearly, we fill in the gaps if we find that the DWP and the local authority are not able or set up enough to deliver some services. But our first point of call is always, what are the local authorities doing? What are the DWP doing? Next slide, please. Aster's strategy in terms of welfare reform is about supporting our customers and protecting the business. And it's really important as you develop your strategies to support your customers that you understand your business. Our key, if not sole, our certainly key objective in Aster is everyone has a home. And so any spare resource is directed towards bricks and mortar, not necessarily to advice and support. So while we will support our customers to help them pay their rent, we will do no more than really the minimum that is required, so that we can continue to fund our massive development program. Helping people transition onto universal credit, I always thought, was the most important thing in the world. But apparently it's not. There are other priorities in all our organisations, and we need to make sure that our work on universal credit joins up with all of the other key work that our businesses do and isn't seen as a separate piece of work. So it's really important you get to know your business as well as know your customers. And from there, you can find your own balance of supporting your customers and protecting your own businesses. Thank you, Devon. Next one, please. So in terms of knowing your customers, as a collection of ex-local authority transfers, we have the majority of our properties clustered into small regions, and we have many staff who have worked with us for many years. We also have many tenants who have been long-term customers of ours. So as a result, we do have a lot of our staff who do know our more vulnerable customers. And that, from our point of view, is a good thing. It's really important that we get to know our customers. And one of the things that we've said to the DWP is that we know our customers better than they do. When people go in to claim benefits and go and speak to their job coach, people will tend to say the things that are necessary to be said in order to get their benefit. And that isn't always the entire truth of the story. Whereas when we speak to customers, they're much more likely to tell us the warts and all story of their experience. And so we've said to the DWP, we are in a much better place to know our customers than perhaps they are. And so it's really important that we continue to do that. And in terms of how you know your customers, there's various number of approaches that you can consider. We're obviously, we're generally having a conversation about generic versus specialist workers. Because of our size and our history, we've got a kind of specialist setup, but I've certainly spoken to other organisations who have moved to a more generic working in order to have smaller patch sizes for individuals so that they can get to know their customers. And that is something that every organisation really needs to think about. How are you structured, and is that structure the best way to get to know your customers? That said, if you are specialist and the opportunities to change to generic are not really there are other ways of doing it. Welfare reform specialists could be used to go out and meet customers, or you could use customer champions. I've certainly heard of other organisations doing that, although I'd have to say that Aster hasn't gone down that road. But customers talking to other customers, sharing experience is got to be a good thing, and I would encourage you to use your customer engagement processes to see if you can find some customers that are willing to talk to other customers. And then you need to think about your communications, digital or non-digital. Clearly, communicating with customers is very expensive, and so we try to do everything digitally. But of course, if you're trying to communicate with someone who's not digitally engaged, the last thing you want to do is send them an email. So it's getting that balance right. Non-digital communications are expensive. Digital communications don't necessarily hit the customers you want. So again, you need to know your customers and know the best way to communicate with them. Next slide, please. So helping customers onto universal credit, the whole purpose of this webinar is about that. And what I would say is that helping customers onto universal credit is just the process from our point of view. The outcome that we are focused on is that they can pay their rent. It's important that we transition people on, but the purpose is that they can then pay their rent. And I repeat that because I repeat it to all our staff. It's not about supporting customers full stop. It's about supporting them to pay their rent. Now, we didn't do very much preparation work with customers. When we did speak to customers and say, universal credit is coming, you can have your rent, you can have your own rent money to pay, and it's going to be monthly and everything. And then the customer said, well, when is that happening? And we said, next year. And when they got up off the floor and stopped laughing, they kind of said, come and tell us when it's actually happening. Lots of our customers have got so many issues going on in their day-to-day lives that they're dealing with kind of now, that getting the timing of that communication around universal credit right is really, really important. So know your rollout program, know what customers are going to be affected and when, and make sure that the communications that you choose are very timely. I think in hindsight, we should have done some more targeted work about getting people ready for UC, and it's something that we're looking to do now. And we're going to think about contacting and having conversations with our people who are already on universal credit to learn their journey, to learn their experience, and then we can try and share that journey and share that experience with people who haven't quite gone onto universal credit yet. And our rollout program for our regions goes on right until the middle of next year. So we're going to be using the experience of customers who've already been through it to learn and then transfer that knowledge to new customers. But we want to make sure that we target those customers correctly and make sure that we don't waste communications to people that don't necessarily need it. Okay, yeah, next slide, please, Evan. So one of the things that we do, obviously, in focusing about rent payment is around a triage process. So when we get notification from the DWP that a customer is moving on to universal credit, we undertake a triage process. That has got two stages to it. There's a desktop review where we look at the history of the account, look at any information that we've got on the computer about that particular person's vulnerabilities and such like, and then we try and make contact with that customer to talk to them about how they are preparing for universal credit, to get a view about whether they are likely to pay their rent when they get their payment. If we think that they're not likely to pay their rent and they're going to struggle, we can obviously put an alternative payment arrangement in place. But really at that triage stage, it's about risk assessment. What is the risk of that customer not paying their rent? What are the barriers to that customer not paying their rent? Is it around digital exclusion, financial exclusion? Let's identify that support need and see if we can ask the local authority or the DWP to meet that support need, or try and meet it ourselves if more appropriate. Next slide, please, Devon. So the triage outcomes is that we get from that conversation and from the desktop review can be one or all of these things. A support referral. So sometimes we'll recognize that someone might struggle with it, but they really want to give it a go, and we will let them do that. I think it's really important that we let customers give it a go, that we don't take responsibility away from them in terms of putting an app in place too quickly, that we allow them to learn. Because at the end of the day, this is about customers becoming more financially engaged with society generally, not just with their benefit system. And if we can allow them to learn about managing money on a monthly basis, if we can allow them to learn about managing bank accounts and direct debits, then we will be giving them tools that they can use for the rest of their life. So it's really important that we can consider that some people will have support, but they won't necessarily have an alternative payment arrangement put in place. Now, some customers will have an alternative payment arrangement put in place. Of our customers, I think we're running at about 14 or 15% of our customers have put on an alternative payment arrangement, and we do it as a kind of a last resort. We try to avoid it as much as possible. One of the reasons that we avoid it is because of the payment process from the DWP. Because that is further delayed, and it's really difficult to manage a rent account when there is an APA in place, particularly if a customer is working part-time. So we try as much as we can to avoid APRs for people who are working part-time, and only have APRs for people who don't work at all, where their housing element is very likely to be their full rent. And then that's much easier to manage that rent account and understand what money we should be receiving. Another outcome of the triage, which is probably the most important one, is the question that we ask the customer: when are you going to pay your rent and how often are you going to pay it? When do you get your universal credit paid to you? If you get your universal credit paid on the 15th of every month, we will expect payment of rent equivalent to a full calendar month plus something off the arrears a day or two after they get their universal credit. So it's really important during that triage process to identify the date that someone will get paid. Sometimes you have to guess that, but it can be an educated guess. If you know the date the customer has applied for universal credit, if you haven't got any other information, you can just add 6 weeks to it, and that is likely to be the universal credit payment date. Continued conversations with that customer will make sure you get that date absolutely right. And it's really important that you know that date, because you can then set up things in the system against the date that is expected. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And another key factor is that we can identify the non-engagers. One of the things the DWP said to us a year or so ago was that a project on non-engagement is going to be the next massive research project. We're yet to see it, but I do think there has to be some kind of work around people that don't engage with the state, if you like. And I think that pushing people through a digital application to universal credit will potentially increase the numbers of people that don't engage, will increase the number of people who step out of the benefit system entirely and work on a individual cash basis, and potentially on the street and all of that kind of thing. So eventually that can happen to people that don't engage. So it's really important that we identify our customers who aren't engaging and try methods to make contact with them, to try to find what it is about them that means that they don't engage and talk to us. Okay, next slide, please, Devin. So in terms of helping customers to pay rent, we've done a couple of lean reviews using lean methodology to review our support services and also our customer account rent collection service. So in terms of the support service, originally we had a service that delivered debt and benefit services, and that was connected to the customer accounts directorate. And then we had a customer engagement team that dealt with helping people get into work and kind of digital stuff, but they were in a completely different directorate. Our understanding of the universal credit process, and particularly the customer journey, says that those two services need to be joined together. We need support staff who understand about how to access digital technology, about how to access and deliver digital training, who can do budgeting support for people, and who can do benefit calculations. And that's obviously where the policy and practice tool comes in, whereby we can get staff and say to staff, you don't need to have all of that knowledge in your head. You can have the skills of interacting with customers, and the customer interaction skill is the one that we want. The information that you need is in a tool, whether that's policy and practice or other tools. It's important that we get those staff skilled in engaging with customers, identifying support needs and working with those customers to meet those support needs as best we can. We've also done a lean review of our rent collection processes in light of universal credit, and we are struggling, as probably the rest of you are, with the idea of charging rents weekly and customers receiving benefit per calendar month. And lots of people are kind of struggling around how they understand that. And my answer is just treat them as if they're in work. Most people who are in work get paid per calendar month. Lots of people in work set up a direct debit, and that direct debit is charged per calendar month. So let's treat our universal credit customers in the same way. Let's say, yes, you're due, you have to pay your rent on Monday for that next week. I know that's what the tenancy agreement says, but in reality, you get paid per calendar month on a certain day every month. Let's work out how much you need to pay us per calendar month, and let's set that up as an agreement. We can then monitor that agreement in our housing system, and if that agreement fails, we will be contacting that customer. That's a very different approach to what we currently do, and our current approach is very much based upon the level of the rent account. So if the rent account is in arrear, the customer gets a phone call. Now, if we're phoning a customer and saying your account is arrear, and the customer says, I know, I'm waiting for my universal credit payment to come through, that's a wasted phone call. That's a wasted 5 minutes. That 5 minutes can be better spent talking to someone who has just received their universal credit and hasn't paid us. So think about how you identify the people that you need to speak to in relation to account management. And what I'm saying to staff, a lot of them don't quite believe me at the moment, but I'm saying forget about the arrears, focus on the agreement. If you can get all your customers onto appropriate agreements and all of those agreements are met, then the arrears will look after itself. And then the arrear is just rent that hasn't been collected yet. So really try to think about agreements rather than rent accounts. And that's no different to a direct debit. We make an agreement with a customer to pay a certain amount per calendar month. If the direct debit fails, we chase them. Let's build that principle into our normal weekly tenancies as well. Next slide, please. So some lessons from Aster. I whizzed through a few of these. Firstly, don't panic. Don't panic, get a plan. I want to have that printed on a mug, because if you ain't got a plan, you don't know what you're doing. And so it's really important that you think about your strategic issues from some of the things that I've said today, but also from your own experience, from your own business, from your own customers. Think about all of that and get a plan, manage that plan. Think about the low-hanging fruit. The people who are ready to move on to universal credit, we don't need to do much work with those. Customers who are willing to receive their housing benefit to themselves in preparation for universal credit, low-hanging fruit. Try and talk to customers who currently get part housing benefit and part pay rent themselves, and say to them, well, why don't you just become self-payer? Have your housing benefit paid directly to you, and then you pay your rent. And we can make whatever agreements we want with that customer, and then they are a self-payer. They are then 50% closer to transitioning onto universal credit than they were before they did that. So try to start empowering people to receive their own housing benefit now, even before universal credit comes in. Rent in advance, I think, is something everyone's thinking about, and I've heard of everything from a week in advance to 2 months in advance, and it's not a deposit. Let's be very clear, it's rent in advance. And if a customer can pay it, we will take it from them. If they can't, we will try to set up an agreement at the point of letting to ensure that they do get to a week or 2 weeks or a month in advance over their first few months of a tenancy. Think carefully about buying external data and external tools. Sorry, policy and practice, but it's really important that you think very carefully about what you want. One of our phrases in Aster is hold our nerve, and we're not going to spend our customers' hard-earned money on systems until we know it's exactly what we wanted. And I think policy and practice is a good example. We were watching their development for 12 months before we even made kind of formal contacts. There's lots of people out there trying to sell you lots of data that will tell you what you probably already know about your customers. So just make sure when you're doing your planning, think about what you don't know and you need to know, and then go and search for the people who are providing that data. Don't get too caught up on all the sales pitches. Next slide, please. Engage with the DWP. I think that we've had so much benefit from our engagement with the DWP. It's been worth every single minute that I've sat on every single train traveling backwards and forwards to London. It really has been useful. But it's not just at the national level, and there's obviously a limit to the number of organisations that can engage with the DWP at the national level. Think about it at the local level. Get to know your partnership managers in your local job centres. Get some staff to go and work from their office for a day. Ask if their job coaches want to come in and meet the housing staff. Have a party, exchange views, exchange opinions. We've got to engage with the DWP, and the best way to do that is staff on staff. It's also really important to sing the benefits of universal credit. Universal credit is a fab thing compared to the old benefit system. Paying people monthly is exactly what they should be doing. Allowing people to apply for benefit online and communicate digitally rather than having to traipse down to the job centre every week to tick a box and sign a form. It's brilliant. And the customers who are enjoying universal credit will tell you that time and time again. It is much easier to submit changes. It's much easier to understand what you're getting when you're getting it. Once it's up and running, Transitioning to it is the challenge, but once it's up and running, it's really good. So sing the praises of Universal Credit and make sure that you really get that common purpose with you in the DWP, because there's no point battling against what the DWP are doing. They are doing it, and we need to be positive and singing the positive things if we're to encourage our customers. And use the DWP communications. Don't reinvent your own adverts and your own communications. That potentially confuses customers. If the DWP have got a YouTube video, send that to your tenants. Don't do your own. If they've got a leaflet, send that to your tenants. Don't bother doing your own. Next slide, please, Dan. Managing staff resistance. This is something that I never expected to put on a slide, but we've experienced it hugely. I think our staff, who are very committed to our customers and very committed to our ethical purpose, are really quite angry about how the DWP are doing Universal Credit, because they see the impact on some of their more vulnerable customers. And you've got to manage that staff resistance. You have to accept the staff will get angry about it. You need to let them be angry and to express that. You need to understand what their resistance is about, and you can help them and then understand why Universal Credit is actually a benefit to most people. And then they will start to learn, then they will accept, and then they will buy into it. And it's a similar process for customers. They are angry to start with that they're having to do something different. There's more confusion rather than resistance, perhaps, because they don't understand what they need to do. But helping them will get through that process of learning, acceptance, and then benefit realization. Because when customers have been on Universal Credit for 3 months and it's worked fine for 3 months, they do realize that it is a really good system. Next slide, please, Devon. Recognize that Universal Credit will increase your arrears. There is no doubt about that whatsoever. And whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, it is a thing. And so we just need to accept it. And it's increasing arrears not because customers don't pay, that might increase arrears, but it increases arrears because of the payment cycles. So even if a customer does everything that they should do and pays their housing element directly to their landlord a couple of days after they get their UC, because of weekly tenancies, they could still be running a debt of 2 weeks in arrears. We work with that customer to pay maybe an extra £1 a week or something like that to try to reduce it. But we have to accept that the payment process for people on Universal Credit will result in some arrear. And it's about making sure your business understands that. And so what we do is we've got a arrears predictor, whereby we look at the number of people who are on Universal Credit and what their arrears are, and the number of people who are not on Universal Credit and what their arrears are. And that gives us our current arrears. And then we can look forward and say, actually, when our Universal Credit customers reaches 30% and our non-UC is 70%, then you can work out what that impact is and just kind of drive that forward. I won't go through the maths now. There's some made up figures on the slide there that you can see, where you can see once you vary the number of people on Universal Credit, you can see the overall impact on business. And so in this example, the arrears have gone up from 1.6% to 4% just because people have moved on to UC, not because they've chosen not to pay. So it's really important that you understand the future impact on your business so that your business is prepared for the impending arrears that will come. Next slide, please. And finally, look out for announcements from the DWP on a whole range of issues. Trusted partner status they're working on. They're working on the portal. They are working on the process for paying APAs, which people will be pleased with, assuming it comes up with something better, but they are very much aware, and I think it's really important that we understand that the DWP have received our feedback from lots of landlords who have got APAs in place, saying that the payment process for APAs currently is a challenge for us. They have listened to that and they have committed to think about it. Say any more than that at the moment. But the DWP have certainly got a process of test and learn, roll out slowly, get the feedback, change it, roll out again. In some ways that's brilliant, but from a landlord's point of view, it's a nightmare because it means the rollout of Universal Credit is going on over years and years and years. So any system that we put in place might not be appropriate because the DWP could change something in a few months' time. So it's really important that whatever processes you put in place, they're flexible, they're open for change, and they're regularly reviewed to ensure that they're continued fit for purpose. Don't make a decision now that you can't change in 6 months' time. The DWP are learning and they are changing, and they and they do listen to us. So it is important that we understand the scale of the job the DWP are doing, and that we recognise that they're using a agile and test and learn approach. So what they say and what they put in place today might not be the same as what's in place in 6 months' time or 6 months after that. That's just the nature of the beast. It's the nature of the massive change that they're going through. And we need just to see this as a massive change project over a long period of time, and accept that nothing is going to be set in stone until it is finally finished, which could be another 5 or 6 years away in terms of the full migration. So I think that's all I've got to say today. Hopefully that was of some interest to you. And obviously, if there's any questions, I guess you chuck those through on your panel, and if we've got a chance, we can answer some of those later on.
Thank you very much, Ian. Yes, do please type in any questions for Ian. I'm seeing a few come in right from the comments I made at the outset already. I think it's best just I'm going to summarize briefly, Ian. I just thought that was really interesting. I think a couple of things, the end result being helping residents to pay their rent. I think for DWP, it might be to support people into work, toward independence. Think about what your organization's end result is and how universal credit plays a part in that. And also, you mentioned some of the challenges, so triage your customers, paying rent, working together with other organizations, and helping people to understand how much they're getting paid and when, which is exactly what Zoe is going to talk about, and how we can help to mitigate the impact for the customer. So over to you, Zoe.
Thanks, Devon. I'd just like to say that I think Ian's look at universal credit from an organisational perspective was very useful sort of background to looking at how we can support claimants. I think we'll start with claimants, looking at the main issues for them. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I think most of you will be aware of these. But I'd just like to highlight the first one, which is about knowledge around universal credit. It was something Ian touched on, in that in retrospect, he wished that they had done more information prior to full rollout of the customers that have already moved over. We also had problems initially with errors in assessment. These are getting better. Anecdotally, our customers and people we work with are saying that this was just a learning process for DWP. Monthly payments, a poll pulled this out and said it's one of the key issues. So going back to what Ian was talking about who to target, and I think this will come down to the organisation. And once you've decided who to target, it's what support is needed for those people, and then how support is going to be delivered. And this final one on how support is going to be delivered is the area I'm going to be focusing on. But if we can just look back at who to target, Ian made some comments about using data analysis, and I do agree with him. You've got to be sure that it's going to be useful for you. For housing associations, they don't have the rich data that local authorities have in the SHEBI extracts and the CTRS. I do feel that local authorities can probably can certainly do an awful lot more than some other organisations with proactive identification. And obviously, if you're working in partnership with local authorities, or you're a third sector organisation working with the local authorities, you might be able to access some of this identification work they can do. The facilities for proactive identification probably aren't as great as within housing associations, because they don't have the level of information that local authorities will have. We've worked with quite a few organisations to actually provide identification based on what the organisational requirements are, and there's just a few examples here. But we do realise that for a lot of organisations, actually, that targeting isn't important because they're an on-demand service. So if you're a charity or a customer services, you're going to be helping those who actually come to you rather than identifying those initially in the first place. Once you've looked at who needs support, you've got to look at what support is needed. And again, this is something that Ian was looking at from an organisational perspective. For some people, this will be self-identified, but the triage process is really important. And we work with a very large number of housing associations, local authorities, charities, and a lot of them are using the triage process. And this will be this has to be able to be designed around the needs of the organisation and what the organisation can offer. But there are tools out there that actually assist. A lot of people are doing triage manually. Others are using spreadsheets. We're noticing more and more people moving over to sort of using IT for triage, merely because this gives you the management information and allows you to evaluate the need within your for your organisation and be able to target resources appropriately. I'll just quickly show you that within our calculator, we're designing triage in partnership with quite a few organisations. The questions that will be asked will be decided. Some will be for all organisations, others will have a choice of their own questions. But the key issue is to make it as simple as possible so that questions will only open up in response to other questions. It makes it very quick for staff to go through with customers. And the end result is exactly as Ian said, that it pinpoints where you need to get, where the customer will require further assistance. And with the calculator, if you do it using automation, you can then immediately go to the links for the support that's required. And it tells you areas where no further action is needed. So the main area I'm going to be looking at is how support is delivered. And this can be via two ways. You can have self-service tools, and this really does help you save your resources. If those who can help themselves have access to tools that they can find the information they require simply and easily, those people are out of the way and they're not coming to your customer services department. There will always be people who require an awful lot more support. And for that, Ian mentioned that the benefits calculator that's used at Aster. There's lots of different ones, but it's getting the tools that are right for you, that not just calculate benefit, but provide the advice, support, the direction that your customers need. And I love this slide. It's if you've been on other webinars from Policy and Practice, you might have seen it before. I can't take credit for it. It comes from a webinar from Curo Housing Association. But it sort of resonates with anybody who's ever worked on the front line, that 30% of tenants, well, we've got tenants here, but I think coming from a local authority background, I think its customers will require no support. 50% will require some support, and 20% will require an awful lot of support, and they take up all the time. If you can move the 30% requiring no support or the 50% requiring some support through your systems as quickly as possible, your staff's expertise, your resources can be concentrated on the 20% that actually require support to process a universal credit claim. I'm just going to show you a very quick example of how you can assist those, firstly, those who can help themselves, but secondly, those who might need a lot more support. On the calculator, you put in very simply, go through 3 screens to put in information about a household. And the results and reports then tell somebody how much their universal credit is. Now, this is all that some people will need. That 30% will require no support. If this is put in a public portal, in a customer services area, I know a lot of housing associations have embedded this in their own client portal. You're seeing a more complex version of the calculator here. It's slightly stripped down for the customer version, but it allows them to see how much universal credit they'll get. And for many people, that knowledge is enough for them to plan their lives and plan how they're spending under universal credit. For others, we've got a very nice graph that shows the differences between the current system and universal credit. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of very simplified graphics. One housing association said they knew that this was a calculator for them when they were working with a client who was pretty nonchalant about the changes that were taking place and what he could do to help himself. Until this graph came up, and because of the colours, because he could see it graphically, at that point he leant in and engaged with the rest of the process. So I think this sort of graphical display is extremely important to quite a lot of customers. And although this might be all some clients need, if you've got support staff who try to help that 20% with quite complex needs, and Ian did mention that some of the people who are moving over to universal credit, they've got other things going on in their lives, you might need to provide further information. So throughout the calculator, we've got advice. And really, this is just to give your staff, the people who are supporting the customers, it provides a direction on things to talk about, things that are going to be important, things that people might need to know in order to be able to move forward. So, for example, this person knows about the level of transitional protection, and that will inform a discussion on changes of circumstances, how long that lasts. Similarly, they know about the minimum income floor and how, being self-employed, the minimum income floor is being used to assess their benefits. If you're going into a lot of detail with a client, for example, one of the problems we looked at initially was incorrect benefit, you need some sort of tool to do a breakdown of how that benefit's been calculated. And the more detail for your expert welfare benefit officers or expert support staff out there, the more detail you can go into, the better, because they will then be able to see if this is something they need to take up further or if it's just something they need to explain to the client. On this example, we've got, because this person's self-employed, they've got the minimal income floor, we actually can look into how that affects their benefit and see that an additional £246 of income is taken into account. I was showing that so you can see that you need to be able to show information at two levels, a simple level for your clients to engage with, but you do need that advanced level for people who need further support. I'll just move on to the next slide. Yeah, we also produce customer-focused action. I won't go into this. If you want to see any of these in more detail, do let us know afterwards. But actually making your advice personalised is extremely important. None of us really respond to general advice. If we're told that we're going to be affected by some tax changes next year, we don't really engage until we're told exactly how much that's going to be off our income. So throughout our calculator, we've tried to give personalised advice. And even if you don't use a calculator, it's worth bearing in mind the information we're getting from all of our all the people who use a calculator, people we've worked with, is that personalised advice has a much greater impact. Budgeting support is one of the big areas that are the people we're working with, the organisations we're working with, it's becoming more and more important to them with the transfer over to universal credit. And budgeting isn't just about income and costs, it's around how to manage during the 6-week wait. The landlord payments, for example, if the landlord's receiving a certain amount, how much is the tenant left to pay? And this was something Ian touched on, that in fact, direct payments might actually, for some people, if they can manage their own payments, might be more complex than they're worth. The impact of advance payments, we've been asked by a number of the people we work with if we can sort of incorporate that some way so that people can make a choice about whether to take the pain in one hit or to spread it over a few months. I'm also looking at weekly earnings against monthly universal credit, and the change in universal credit from month to month and how you can incorporate that into budgeting.
Great. I think what we're going to do briefly now is just hand over to, we're going to cut this section short where we talk a bit about budgeting and how we can help, how the software can help you to see exactly when people's payments will be made, and just hand off to Natasha and Carl, because I think it's kind of important that we get as much as possible the frontline perspective on some of the challenges too. Natasha, Carl, are you on the call and ready to contribute?
Oh yes, good morning everyone.
Fantastic. Just to kind of introduce you both, I just wanted to sort of say you've got the full amount of time we discussed before, and I think what we'll do is we'll take the questions from 11:30 onwards. So you've got about 10 minutes or so.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Okay, so just to start, my name's Carl Arty and I'm with the personal budgeting support team within Croydon Council and the Gateway Services, and Natasha is one of the interventions managers here as well. Just to give you a quick background on universal credit in Croydon, as you know, Croydon Council is one of the largest London boroughs. We have a population of over 460,000 people, and we went onto Universal Credit Full Service from June 2015, and our last postcode went live in April 2016. We have two very small postcodes still in the live service. That's because they're those job centres are out of borough. Within Croydon, we have around 20,000 universal cases, and that represents about 40% of all universal credit cases in the full service in London. So we've had some challenging times over the last 2 years, but it's been interesting to hear the perspectives from other local authorities in particular, and other organisations. So I can give you quickly a rundown of what we do as a local authority to help changes and the impacts of people transferring onto universal credit. Within Croydon, we set up the Gateway and Welfare Services, and that it was primarily aimed at intervening in, for customers at an early stage. So when Universal Credit came along, the personal budgeting support team was set up to provide personal budgeting support for any Universal Credit customer who was referred to us by Job Centre Plus, and we would look at their circumstances that way. What we do is we co-locate with the job centre, so we have officers based within the 3 local job centres within Croydon, and we have JCP staff based in our office as well in Croydon Council. The first thing I'd say, it's essential that you have a relationship with your local job centres and your partnership managers, because it's very, when things go wrong, they can go wrong very quickly, and if you haven't got that good relationship, it's difficult to rectify them. From a Croydon point of view, some of the challenges we have had primarily are from identifying vulnerability and dealing with vulnerable customers, and I think that would be the case with most local authorities. One of our main concerns is customers who have mental health issues or drug and alcohol issues. We have a very large emergency accommodation population in Croydon, and as a result, when we're housing people with mental health issues who have been recently discharged from hospital, making the claim for universal credit isn't necessarily the problem, it's maintaining the claim for universal credit. So we have an officer who assists people digitally to help them make the claim, to the point where we'll even put reminders in their phones to make sure they attend their appointments. But if they don't have the capacity to actually attend those appointments, the claim gets closed down, and with the lack of backdating, it can be an issue to get it reopened. So we are looking at ways in which we can improve that, and we're working with our local partnership manager to find a better solution for particularly our vulnerable customers. In terms of, I think it's already been mentioned, we've experienced a significant increase in rent arrears. With housing benefit, we've seen a drop of collection rates in our council accommodations from about 90% to about 53%, which is unsustainable. But we're working with a range of organisations and with our customer group to tackle that. Our personal budgeting support team, when we get referrals directly from the job centre, it's primarily to look at how do we mitigate the 6 week, well, 6 to 8 week normally time frame where they've got no money. So within Gateway, which is the department we work within, our personal budgeting support officers are former housing benefit officers, former revenue, council tax officers, so they have a breadth of knowledge of the welfare benefit system and housing matters. So one of the key areas we are looking at is when we get a referral, we look at overall household debt, and what we're finding is we're picking up people who have had existing rent arrears and large rent arrears for a long time, and through our through the work, we're trying to find ways to prevent eviction, because from a selfish point of view, from a council, it will be easier for us to help prevent the eviction than to actually house them once they become homeless, which costs us a lot more money. So all our officers have access to discretionary housing payment system, where if need be, we can prevent evictions by using DHP or our Croydon discretionary support scheme. But that we do that in conjunction with an action plan and things like that.
Great.
Sorry.
No, go on. Sorry, I wasn't sure whether you'd finished. I was wondering whether it'd be really interesting to hear from Natasha as well, and see if there are any interesting stories from the front line too. In terms, particularly if there is, something positive would be great around to just to kind of hear about how you guys have actually been able to help and support some customers.
Yeah, I mean, so our PBS team is the ones that will predominantly work with our customers, and it isn't always necessarily kind of worst case scenario. Like Carl mentioned, one of the areas that we kind of look at, it's that transition period where they're awaiting kind of the move onto universal credit. And when we get those referrals, it's about our guys work really well to kind of with them, utilising the kind of the budget planning tool, action plans, and see how they can support them. We also, because the way that our department is set up with in Gateway, there's so many different departments that we can kind of work alongside to support the customer. So for example, employment is a big key one for us. Customers who are moving on to universal credit who don't have employment, it's early intervention. Let's see if we can get them in a position where they can start working, and looking at kind of the long term. And I think that's the approach that we take with all of our customers. It's not just looking at kind of the short term issues, it's actually long term. What can we do with these people to kind of improve their financial situation and provide them with more stability going forward? Carl's already touched on kind of the housing side, so there's plenty of examples and cases where we've done that.
Right.
Sorry, it's anyway. Sorry. What other?
One of the key things we try and help with is it's been a bit of a challenge. Customers who have been benefit capped, and it's been working with the DWP and with other departments within the council. We're able to mitigate the effects of the benefit cap as well, but again by helping people find employment, working on people's budgets, and ensuring that evictions don't take place. So those are some of the areas, and we've been actually quite successful with that. We've seen, I don't think we've seen any evictions due to the benefit cap because of I don't think we've seen any evictions due to the benefit cap because of universal credit, because of our early intervention. It has been challenging because there's a lack of data sharing, but working with some of the information we already hold on people from the existing housing benefit system, we've been able to intervene early. So it's working with customers, working with families as well to ensure that they have a sustainable long-term solution.
And just to kind of come in there, we've well, first of all, thank you both, Carl and Natasha. I think Carl, from that sort of the impact on the organisation, and Natasha, thanks for being so willing of sharing a couple of your experiences of working and supporting customers positively. We've hit 11:30, but this is, as I've mentioned before, this is our most highly attended webinar. So we're going to stay online for another 15 minutes or so just for questions and talk through the next steps, because again, for policy and practice, it's great to get your feedback too. I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and suggest that we talk through one of the things that we'd like to do is one of the questions in the poll in advance was around helping people understand affordability, budget, and understand the monthly payments. So I wanted to give Zoe the time to kind of take that as the first question and talk a bit about how we can help residents understand their payments a little bit more effectively.
Okay, thanks, Devon. Yeah, I actually saw some questions on this as well. It was obviously very important in the poll with people getting paid or incomes being weekly and universal credit monthly. So we've got this feature, and actually this is something that if you do manually, it takes an awful long time. I'm sure a lot of people out there are doing this manually, and you'll know what I'm talking about. That if you've got weekly income, in this case earned income, maintenance from a former partner, if you can have a tool that will show you how much for the next year the likely monthly payments will be, you can see for this person in September they will likely get 1,307. But in November, that's £70 more. And there's different ones in between. So if you've got a feature like this, I know that one of the customers who was helping us work on this and who had actually originally suggested it to us, was they were hoping to hand these out print these off and hand them out to their housing association tenants, so that people could see which months they had to save for in advance. And to know that when they got more income in their universal credit, that it was actually going to go down the next month, and that couldn't all be just seen as additional money. It also helps people with budgeting. It helps organisations who are budgeting for people. And it also helps the person to help themselves, which I think is what the end result we all want. So yeah, if there's any other questions about that, I did see there were some questions, but if there's any more, I'm happy to go over it with people. At another time.
Thanks. I think the only other...
Devon, can I?
Sorry, go on, Ian.
So I was just going to say, one of the things we've done in Aster is create an agreement calculator, and it was only something we played about with on Excel, to be honest, and we're still thinking about how that might be usable and scalable. But an agreement calculator basically was just able to very quickly put in the rent that is due on a spreadsheet just down a line, and next to it the payments that we agree with the customer, and next to it would appear, as if by magic, a graph that would show the impact of their payments, so that we could see the rent being charged every week, and you could see the impact for customer paying maybe per calendar month one sum, and then maybe in a weekly amount another bit. And so they would be able to graphically see how their rent account is getting better over time as a result of their agreement plan. And we were thinking that if we can get that onto our website, it might be a policy and practice tool, I'm not sure, but if we can get that onto our website, then a customer can see that, and then a customer could say, actually, if I increase my payments, I can pay off my arrears more, or if I increase my payments, I can go into credit and then have a rent-free time in December. Or if I've got a car that needs repairing this week and I don't pay my rent and I increase my payments over the next few months, I can see I can catch that up. And to be able to pick up on what Zoe said about the visualization of that, customers, in my experience, really like that graph. The numbers are just numbers and just fade into the paper, but the graph makes a real impact on customers. So that's just something that we're thinking about at the moment, but we haven't fully developed.
Thanks very much. And again, if you're willing to share that, certainly policy and practice, we'd be happy to take a look. And as might others on the webinar. Just the final point I wanted to add, there was one other question around affordability and assessing affordability in advance. So we've combined the benefit calculator with a budgeting calculator to look at income versus costs. And you can see that because we've calculated things like, or you'd already entered things like rent levels, council tax, we've taken that into account. And things like utilities, so often people don't know what their utility bills are at that point. So you can make a note to say, give us the full amount, give us an accurate amount, but you can also click here and just use the average. So here it's calculated that for a household of that size, this is how much they're expected to spend. And we've got that for all of these elements, so that they can very quickly see where they've got, in this case, they've got cash surplus versus their costs. And that can be broken down to, again, if you pulled off the printout, you'd be able to see the extent to which there's a rent shortfall between the housing element and their rent, and also ways in which they can maybe able to increase their income or make savings too. So you can see again there may be opportunities here for them to again sort of mainly thumbs up signs in this case, but actually here it looks like they're spending more than might be expected for a household of their size on groceries. Wanted to touch on those things because I know budgeting and assessing affordability and helping people to budget better has been a theme across the questions that I've seen coming up. I'm going to flick back across the presentation and then open up the panel as well, just so I can see any other questions that have come up. So one question for Ian. There's a question: does Aster physically assist new tenants to claim universal credit at sign up?
Yeah, good question. So we basically look at the individual circumstances at sign up and do what is necessary at that point. I think that a lot of people move on to universal credit as a result of the move into one of our properties. So we can't ask them how much do you get on universal credit because they don't claim it yet. So we will see what that customer needs. If that customer feels and appears able to understand their own benefits, entitlement, and to claim their own benefit, then we will simply signpost them to the website to claim universal credit or to the job centre. If a customer is really unsure about all of that, then we can, we're developing the use of the policy and practice tool at sign up to work out affordability. And so I guess the answer is it depends upon what the customer needs at that point. We try to routinely do very little. We try to identify the customer need and respond to that as best we can at that point. I don't know if that answers the question, but
well, it sounds like in some cases you do stretch to that, but on the whole,
yes,
try to avoid. I think just to support them toward help themselves. Question for Natasha. To what extent should organisations consider a tenant's broader credit commitments and how they're servicing these? So from the perspective of someone helping people to manage their budgets as a means of better understanding their budget and prioritising different debt payments. How deep down the sort of hole of debt do you get, Natasha?
So with ourselves and on our team, so it depends on kind of the debts that you're talking about. So if the debts that the customer has is predominantly internal, for example, with the local authority, and maybe the odd arrears here and there with external organisations, then our personal budget team, they will look at that and they can kind of take that into consideration when setting up arrangements with them, especially if looking at internally if there's anything we can do. So as Carl mentioned, some of our officers are like former council tax officers, so they have that kind of background, that knowledge. If they've got outstanding benefits, then they kind of work with them to see where they can do a reasonable adjustment and review with the customer and help them budget. For customers where their debts are much higher and they've got a lot of them externally, then we work very closely with our internal debt advisor as well as South West London Law Centre to get the customers the more in-depth debt advice that they need. And we do work alongside those people that the debt advisors, to ensure that when we are setting up action plans with them, that we're kind of reviewing it and taking it into account. So for us, it is very important that we, when we're looking at financial stability for the customer, we take the whole picture into account and use the advice of the debt advisors and stuff to make sure that that customer can get the assistance that they require, and that any arrangements, anything that we're setting up, is that those are all taken into account. There's no point ignoring it and then the customer falls further into debt, because that's not what we're about, and it's not going to help them on their journey going forward. So we do a lot of that, and obviously depending on the nature, every customer is different, we tailor it differently, and that will dictate to us how we review the case and kind of what actions we do going forward. Is there a need for financial stability for
Great.
them? So for example, utilising the discretionary support scheme.
And are you seeing an increase in some of that? So you're seeing an increase in things like food and fuel poverty, or an increase in demand for those kinds of support for your most vulnerable customers? Are you kind of seeing that on the ground?
Yeah, definitely. Especially when you're talking about the transition period for a customer going on to universal credit, to go 6 weeks with no income is going to impact somebody. So we are seeing, for example, our local Croydon discretionary support one. So that's the one that deals with food bank referrals, gas and electricity, and travel. We are seeing an increase in customers take up on that. Even more so if, for example, their claim is delayed. So there is obviously the option for an advance payment, but for some customers, they can't get it straight away, or the advance payment, because of the delay, might not necessarily cover what they need for the period they need it for. So we do have to support a lot more customers with those services. And if you look at even like the arrears side, so if there is a delay between a customer claiming universal credit and they're not getting the back day instantly, that's an arrears there. So we do see kind of more of those.
Yeah, and I think there are just
more of that now with our discretionary support services.
I think that just underlines, Natasha, the need to kind of work in a more joined up way. So, for example, where you identify challenges around fuel poverty, one of the things software does is determine whether or not they may be eligible for a warm home discount, whether or not they meet the qualifying criteria for that. So again, there are other schemes that I think, again, utility companies are very keen to promote that might help on the budgeting side of things. And you can't expect all of your advisors to be aware of these things. So sometimes it's helpful to have a system that brings that to the forefront of their mind. A couple of questions on the same theme for Carl. You mentioned a pretty significant drop off in collection rates. And just to clarify, you were talking about those that moved on to universal credit when you were talking about that drop off rate in your presentation. Is that right, Carl?
Yeah, that's correct. So that's those that are moving from housing benefit onto universal credit for their housing costs.
And you don't know what's happened to the general collection rate if you average that out. I mean, again, it's a bit weighted by how many people have moved across onto UC, and as a full service authority, I know you see more of that than most on this webinar. But if you know what's happening, kind of the implications of that for your general needs collection, do you have that? You might not. So sorry to put you on the spot.
I don't have the actual figures, but generally, we're seeing we're serving more notices on customers. We're seeing higher. So specifically, this is a bigger problem for our people in emergency accommodation because the rents are so much higher, and the erratic nature of their lives. So that's been the main problem.
Okay, yeah. So it's not just the move to UC; it's what's going on in their life and what's going on in their life before you as well. Which
it's a combination of factors, but it coincided with the move to UC. So for customers, because what's happened is mirrored. The drop has been mirrored in our normal council housing and our emergency accommodation. We've seen an equivalent drop in collections.
Okay. So a couple of things to be concerned about there. A question next for Zoe. What resources or tools do you suggest for vulnerable people with little or no IT skills? And I think that's important, just given your presentation.
Yeah, I think it's something that Carl touched on. In fact, the vulnerable people and those with little or no IT skills are actually, well, particularly vulnerable people, often very hard to reach. I think that these people, there will always be customers that need support, and everything we've worked on has been fed by our customers who want something that works for them supporting people as well as people who can self-help. So some of the things that we showed you with around the graphs, things that can actually get people engaged, are very important. But I think actually the problem does come down to what Carl was saying, is about identifying vulnerable people. And I do know that for housing associations in particular, this has been a real problem. That in fact you have to, for some people who can't make their UC claim, there's a lot of resources taken up in sitting with them to help them through the verification process and to ensure they actually make that claim. I think that in the end it comes down to engagement. For most organisations, Ian was talking initially about knowing customers. For the people who aren't with housing associations, I think it's going to be very, very tricky to identify some of these people. And it sounds like Croydon are doing their best to identify the vulnerable people and support them through the process.
Yeah, I think it comes down to, from my perspective, it comes down to something Ian mentioned on one of his slides about the non-engagers, identifying the non-engagers. Now, this webinar isn't about it, but we have been using data, working very closely with Croydon, for example, to identify those households that are most at risk of homelessness and what the triggers are. And those that, for example, we can start to look at those that are engaging, those that aren't, and start to understand why. I won't spend too much time talking about it here because I think we're running low on time already. There are a couple of other questions, but I wanted to make sure, while we've still got sort of 3/4 of you that originally attended on the webinar, that we just cover off a couple of other things. So I think the first of those was to ask, to do the next poll. So just to understand what resources you need to put in place to assist clients that are transitioning onto universal credit. So I've launched the poll. You should see it. For those of you that are still on, it'd be really helpful to have an answer. And I'll run it for just 20 or 30 seconds or so. So what do you need to help to successfully roll out universal credit? Is it to simplify benefits advice? Is it to simplify budgeting advice? Is it helping people into work? Is it providing a self-service benefits calculator so you can increase the number of people that can help themselves? Is it identifying and focusing support where it's needed? So that last point about identifying those that are in particular vulnerable. I'm going to just give it a couple more seconds and then close the poll and share the results. But I think we've got a whole range of organisations on this webinar, so some of them may be Welfare to Work, where the focus is on helping people into work, or you might have people from a local authority who are taking on that responsibility. I'm going to share those results. And clearly, focusing support where it's needed is the most significantly the biggest element. And I think there are 2 points there. So perhaps it is worthwhile me talking a little bit about how we use local authority data to help with that, but also just to emphasise and reiterate that the importance of the set of triage questions that Zoe highlighted very briefly at the start of her presentation. So being able to ask at the outset, who needs what kind of support is, I think, a really good way of determining those that perhaps can support themselves. So you can focus your attention and resources on those that need the additional handholding toward independence. And then I think there was just one other question that tied into this as well, this kind of result, which is to say, and to get the panelists involved in a question is, when do you get pushback? What do you do when you get pushback when you're offering support? And do you get that?
Well, I can take that question, Devon, if you like.
Please.
In terms of Aster, if people don't engage with us, we look to put them on an alternative payment arrangement. And we try and do that on a temporary measure, and we say to them, we inform that customer that we've done that for a temporary measure. They need to engage with us, and then we give them notice when that APA might be coming to an end. In terms of the rent account, that's what we do. Obviously, in terms of trying to contact them, then it's normal processes of trying to phone them at different times and knock on the door. But generally, if someone is not engaging, that tells us that there is a risk of them not paying their rent when they get their universal credit, and so we will put an APA on. One of the other ways of getting them to engage is to also ask the DWP to put a third-party agreement in place if they've got an arrear. What that does is take a significant amount of money off their benefit, and then we can say to them, if you engage with us, we will remove that third-party arrangement and put in a much smaller third-party arrangement. And so that's the kind of carrot and stick that we use with the DWP's third-party arrangement that can be very expensive. And that has worked with customers saying, DWP are taking too much money off me because of the arrears with you. And we say, well, engage with us and we will amend that third-party agreement.
Brilliant. Is there anything Colin and Natasha wanted to add, i.e. when you've got people who have been referred on to you for personal budgeting support, but perhaps don't turn up or aren't interested in what's on offer? I'm sure it happens.
So because especially those that are facing eviction, it's very much a carrot stick approach in terms of the offer for DHP to help reduce or clear the rent arrears. But if we still get no engagement, because we work so closely with the DWP, we co-locate, we work with work coaches as well. We find that's a very useful system, but sort of last resort, it will always go for the APA solution and rent arrears deductions directly from source.
Okay, well, I think that stick and carrot point and it being important enough is going to be key. I'm going to start to draw it to a close, but I wanted to just highlight, again, if there are any other key challenges that you felt weren't covered. I think Ian, Carl, Natasha, you've done a brilliant job of outlining the steps you're taking, and everyone in the audience has played their part in participating with just a whole range of questions. We try to answer as many as possible, some in sort of a general sense. We're going to go through them in detail and handle some of those in the follow-up. Just in terms of sort of next steps, Zoe, do you want to sort of mention briefly what teams across the list we have here, across housing associations, local authorities, are finding the software tool you talked about useful?
Yeah, it's actually very varied. And a lot of these organisations you can see here, including Aster, who've been just brilliant, have really fed into the development of some of the tools that we've developed to help people migrate across to universal credit. I didn't have a chance to actually show you one of the tools, which is one of the areas we've been talking about, the 6-week wait, but it does sort of inform advance payments. So that's been developed with lots of housing associations and local authorities. Amongst housing associations, it's being used for lettings, to see if tenancies are sustainable, general support, for budgeting, and all the housing associations are using it slightly differently, but some are using it across multiple teams. Amongst local authorities, it's being used by housing departments in a very similar way to housing associations, but it's also being used by customer services, so that they can give people an overview of their likely benefit entitlement and if they are offering debt counselling services. But on top of that, we have special back-to-work providers who are trying to get people into employment, and a number of charities now, more and more charities, for example, homelessness charities, who are helping those who are homeless, to actually see what their benefit entitlement is and try and move them forward with their lives and into work. So it's a large range, a wide range.
Great, and I think just to kind of the history of it is really started out as a tool to help people understand their benefit entitlement very quickly and very easily, and understand what would happen if they were to try and take different steps, like where they could make savings or where they could move into work. And I think some of what Zoe's shown is really how we've grown. I think that's really all we were doing when we first started working with Aster, but how we've grown by working with and learning from the feedback from our customers and advice, and that's something that we intend to continue to do. Some of the feedback we've had is, I'll just read a couple out. So the best reaction I got was, "I'm definitely getting a job now." That's in reaction and in response to the visual charts that can show how much better off in work people can be. And the second one, I think the calculator is brilliant, really easy to use. Email, print, comparison, all fabulous. And I think that's bigger. I think that point about it being easy to use for expert advisors and the depth to which you can go into, but also for non-experts to be able to, the majority of our calculations don't go into the depth that we can go into, because actually sometimes it's just about getting to the answer as quickly as possible. We've gone through questions. I'll see if there are any more. But before I do that, I'll just go through the next steps and say what I'll do immediately after this is I'll send you out a short survey. So you should get that immediately after the webinar's closed. Really grateful for those of you who have stayed on for this long. If you could just stay on for a couple more minutes and complete that. Any questions or clarifications you might have, we'll go through these questions that we've done our best to answer in the time we've got. And again, if you'd like to understand more about our software and book a demonstration for you and your colleagues, do let us know, and you'll get a call back as soon as someone in our team is able to later on this week. And the next webinar is on the 11th of October, how to future-proof your council tax reduction scheme. But that touches on that point about identifying vulnerable households, because again, the principles behind it are very much the same. So if you'd like to register for that, you'll have the opportunity in the follow-up email. That's it. Thank you very much. Are there any final words from Ian, Carl, Natasha that you wanted to add? Ian, first of all.
No, just good luck and don't panic. It will sort itself out one way or another, universal credit, and I think that the future's bright and we just need to manage it as a process of change.
Great. Carl, Natasha?
Yeah, just like to echo those points and just make sure early intervention really is the key.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Carl.
I think that's a really important point to end on, and one that sort of, and also just wanted to reiterate all of the hard work that the three of you on the call, but also all of you attending, are putting in as frontline advisors. Anything you can do to inform or improve or iterate the process. I do know that DWP are very much in listening mode to try and make sure this lands in a way that creates the minimum of difficulty and minimum of challenge for residents. I know it doesn't always feel like that, but I certainly think from speaking to them that they're very much in listening mode. They need to be influenced, and data is a very data anecdotes and people speaking in one voice, like the poll results we have here with 100 or so respondents on some of them, is really actually powerful and valuable advice on where they can work harder to improve. I'm going to say goodbye now. Thank you to all of those that stayed on to the very end, and thank you to all of those who aren't on anymore. Really sorry for overrunning, but hopefully you understand why and found it all very useful way to spend your time. Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.